They say Kansas is flat. A place of endless horizons where the land stretches so far, it feels like the earth itself is holding its breath. But those who live here know better. Kansas is never still. It is a land moved not by mountains or oceans, but by something far more elusive, forces you cannot see, yet can never escape. The air itself is alive here. It whispers through the grasses, rushes across the plains, and howls with an unrelenting voice that has shaped both the land and the people who called it home. Travelers crossing this heartland often felt it first not in their eyes, but in their bones, the sensation of being watched, carried, even tested by the very air around them. But the invisible hand of Kansas does not stop with the wind. Its rivers carve deep scars into the earth, running silent, restless, and unyielding, as if carrying within their currents the secrets of centuries. Between the winds above and the waters below lies a history of struggle, survival, and reverence. A history of a people who understood these forces, and named themselves after them. And yet, for all its beauty, Kansas hides a tension that never fades. A tension between creation and destruction, between those who revered the land and those who sought to conquer it. To understand this story, we must begin with the first and most relentless of Kansas's forces, the wind. Step into Kansas, and you'll quickly learn that silence is a stranger here. Even on the calmest day, the air moves, slowly, deliberately, as if breathing. But more often, the wind arrives with a sharp edge, pushing against the body, whistling through cracks in homes, rattling fences, bending trees, and announcing its presence in ways impossible to ignore. The people who first walked these plains did not see the wind as empty air. They felt it as a presence, one that could nurture or destroy, comfort or terrify. It came soft and warm across the tall grass, carrying the scents of blooming wildflowers. Yet, within the same breath, it could rise into a force so merciless it stripped fields bare, toppled homes, and carved fear into the hearts of everyone who stood in its path. To settlers, the wind was relentless. It gnawed at them day after day, whispering through the night, leaving them restless, weary, and sometimes broken. To the Kansa people, however, these winds were more than torment. They were sacred. They named themselves, People of the South Wind, embracing what others sought to resist. Where newcomers heard a warning, the Kansa heard a voice. But Kansas winds have a darker side. They do not always come as whispers. Sometimes, they gather in furious spirals, tearing across the plains in violent storms that leave scars still visible decades later. Tornadoes, born of the endless meeting of warm southern air and cold northern currents, turn the sky itself into a weapon. In mere moments, what was calm and open becomes a battlefield of dust, thunder, and ruin. The wind gave Kansas its rhythm, the constant breath of the land. But it also gave Kansas its terror, shaping not only its landscape, but its destiny. And just as the wind moves above, carving its mark in the skies, there are other forces moving below, cutting even deeper, flowing with secrets and shadows. For beneath the restless air lies another power just as unrelenting, one that does not howl or roar, but whispers with equal persistence through the veins of the earth. The rivers. If the winds are the restless breath of Kansas, then its rivers are the silent veins, carrying both life and death through the heart of the land. Long before cities rose from the prairie, long before boundaries carved the map, the waters of Kansas were carving their own paths, shaping valleys, feeding plains, and etching history into the soil. The Kansas River, wide and winding, moves with an unhurried power. Its waters, stained with the colors of the earth, have carried driftwood, fish, and human stories for centuries. Alongside it, the Missouri surges like a restless giant, unpredictable, swollen with currents that have swallowed entire villages and reshaped the land in a single season. These rivers were never just water, they were boundaries, highways, and graveyards. To those who depended on them, the rivers were lifelines. They brought fish to nets, fertile soil to fields, and safe passage for canoes and traders. But the same waters that sustained life could just as quickly turn savage. A sudden flood could erase entire encampments. A shift in the current could swallow crops, cattle, and lives, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. Settlers arriving later would call them unpredictable. The people who first lived by them knew better. They understood that the rivers had moods. And there was something else, something harder to name. Those who spent enough time by the banks often described a strange presence. The steady rush of water at night carried voices, soft, echoing, as if the river itself was speaking. To some, they were the whispers of ancestors, to others, warnings of danger yet unseen. Legends grew from these waters, and with them a reverence that bordered on fear. The rivers did more than shape the land, they shaped identity. To live along their banks meant surrendering to their rhythms, respecting their tempers, and learning their secrets. And no people knew those secrets more deeply than the ones who named themselves for the South Wind, a nation that stood at the meeting place of air and water. For it was here, where the restless winds met the untamed rivers, that the Kansa people carved their place in history. Before Kansas bore its name, before lines on maps and borders of states, there were the Kansa, known also as the Ka, the people of the South Wind. They lived not in defiance of the land, but in harmony with it, their very identity shaped by the same forces that ruled the plains. Where others heard chaos in the winds and menace in the rivers, the Kansa heard voices, lessons, and promises. They built their villages along the rivers, their lodges rising from fertile ground, close enough to hear the constant rush of water yet high enough to withstand its temper. These rivers were not only sources of food and transport, they were threads that wove together daily life, connecting families, trade, and ceremony. When the winds swept across the plains, bending tall grass and rattling the trees, the Kansa felt no dread. They believed the south wind carried messages, binding them to the earth and sky, guiding hunts, harvests, and journeys. Their lives were marked by ritual and reverence. Fires were lit not only for warmth but for ceremony, the smoke rising into the currents of air that carried prayers upward. The rivers, meanwhile, bore witness to their stories, children playing at the banks, warriors setting out on hunts, elders speaking wisdom under the stars. To live as Kansa was to live as part of something larger, to be carried in the flow of forces both visible and unseen. But theirs was not an existence free of hardship. The wind that guided them could also turn violent, and the rivers that nourished them could betray with sudden floods. Yet even in these trials, they did not see cruelty, they saw power. They adapted, endured, and passed down their understanding of the land as sacred knowledge, lessons etched into memory rather than inked. For generations, the Kansa thrived in this balance, but balance is a fragile thing, easily broken. The same winds that carried their prayers carried whispers of change, drifting from the east, of strangers moving westward, of land hungry to be claimed, of treaties spoken but never honored. The rivers that had always connected villages would soon become boundaries, dividing not clans but entire worlds. And in the shadow of those winds and waters, the collision was inevitable. The harmony the Kansa had forged with their land was about to meet the ambitions of those who sought to take it. The winds carried them first, settlers pushing westward, driven by hunger for land and the promise of destiny. Their wagons rolled across the plains like thunderclouds, cutting through prairies that had for centuries belonged to the Kansa people. What the Kansa knew as sacred, the newcomers saw as opportunity. Where the tribe saw a river as a spirit, settlers saw a channel for trade. Where the wind whispered guidance, settlers heard only the call of expansion. At first, there were uneasy exchanges. Goods were traded, words were shared, but beneath the surface lingered a storm. The Kansa saw treaties as solemn covenants, bonds sealed with honor and responsibility. The settlers, however, often treated them as obstacles to be rewritten, ignored, or broken when convenient. Promises made at one fire could vanish with the next gust of wind. The land became the battlefield, not in constant skirmishes of blood, but in a slow, relentless erasure. Villages were pushed from riverbanks. Hunting grounds shrank under the weight of plows. The endless winds that once carried freedom now carried the smoke of burning lodges and the cries of the displaced. The Kansa resisted in the only ways they knew, through resilience, through memory, through their refusal to surrender identity even as their homeland was stripped away piece by piece. But the clash was not equal. Disease arrived with the settlers, striking silently, weakening communities that had once thrived along the rivers. The vast expanse that had nurtured generations was carved into parcels, fenced and claimed by others. By the mid-19th century, the Kansa were forced into treaties that pulled them from their ancestral plains and rivers, pushing them into smaller and smaller tracts of land. Each removal was a wound, each broken promise a scar. What had once been a balance between people, wind, and water was collapsing beneath the weight of ambition and greed. And yet, even as the Kansa were displaced, even as their villages fell silent, the land itself did not forget. The winds still howled across the plains. The rivers still whispered at night. The very forces that defined the Kansa continued to shape Kansas, carrying echoes of a world nearly erased. Because history does not vanish, it lingers, in shadows, in names, in memories carried forward by those who cannot forget. And in Kansas, those shadows are everywhere, hidden in plain sight. Though the Kansa were pushed from their ancestral homeland, the land itself did not yield so easily to forgetfulness. Step into Kansas today, and the shadows of its past are everywhere, woven into the very fabric of daily life, often unnoticed, but never absent. The winds still roar across the plains, just as they did centuries ago. They shake barns, twist highways into danger zones, and rise into storms so violent that the sky itself seems to break apart. Tornado Alley is a modern phrase, but it describes an ancient reality, the same terrifying breath of the land that the Kansa once revered as sacred. Today, people shelter in basements and storm cellars, but long before sirens wailed, the Kansa stood beneath those same skies, reading the winds not as random violence, but as messages from the earth. The rivers, too, remain restless. The Kansas and Missouri still surge in spring floods, spilling across farmlands and towns, forcing evacuations, destroying bridges, leaving behind both ruin and renewal. They no longer bear the canoes of the Kansa, but they carry cargo ships, fishing boats, and barges laden with grain. Yet beneath their surface, the waters still murmur the same songs that once guided entire nations. Locals tell of the strange calm along their banks, of voices carried in the rush of water, of presences felt when standing alone by the current. And then there are the names. Kansas itself bears the imprint of the people who were forced from it. The state, the river, the very identity of this place is a constant echo of the Kansa people. Travelers speak the name without knowing its origin. Children memorize it in classrooms without realizing they are reciting the ghost of a people who once walked the very ground beneath their feet. The shadows stretch beyond geography into memory. Old trails cut into the land by settlers overlap with ancient footpaths carved by tribes. Museum relics, forgotten burial grounds, and place names scattered across the map serve as silent markers of a world that refuses to vanish completely. It is as though the winds themselves refuse to stop whispering, and the rivers refuse to stop flowing with reminders. For in Kansas, the past is not buried, it is alive, woven into every storm, every flood, every uttered name. But shadows, no matter how haunting, are not the whole story. Beneath them lies something deeper, something that refuses to fade, a legacy that endures, hidden but unbroken. The Kansa were displaced, their villages dismantled, their lands parceled off and claimed by others. Yet for all the attempts to erase them, their presence lingers, not only in the soil and sky, but in the marrow of Kansas itself. What was thought lost has never truly vanished. It has only shifted, hidden in plain sight, waiting for those willing to listen. Their name is the most visible reminder. Every time the word Kansas is spoken, the echo of the Kansa people is carried forward. It rings in state halls, in classrooms, in songs and stories, even when those who speak it have no idea of its origin. The name is more than a label, it is a shadow made permanent, a tether to a people who refuse to be erased. But their legacy runs deeper than a name. It can be felt in the values passed silently through generations: reverence for the forces of nature, respect for the cycles of wind and water, and endurance in the face of struggle. In the resilience of Kansas farmers who rebuild after every tornado, in communities that rise again after rivers swallow their streets, there is an echo of the Kansa way of life, adapting, enduring, surviving in partnership with the land. Artifacts rest in museums, yet they are not lifeless. They are fragments of memory, pipes carved from stone, beadwork that gleams under glass, tools worn smooth by hands long gone. Each piece whispers of lives once lived, of prayers once offered, of children who once laughed on these plains. Even in stillness, they hold movement, the same way the wind and rivers never truly stand still. And though history records the Kansa as diminished, their descendants endure. The Kaw nation lives on in Oklahoma, far from their original homeland, yet still bound by identity. They return at times to Kansas, reclaiming pieces of their story, reminding the state and the world that while the land was taken, the spirit was never surrendered. This is the hidden legacy of Kansas. That beneath the highways, the farms, and the towns, there lies another story. A story of people whose voices may have been quieted, but never silenced. The winds still carry their whispers. The rivers still guard their memory. And the state itself still bears their name, as if the land refuses to forget. But the question remains: what does it mean to live in a land that remembers? To walk daily across ground that still carries the weight of voices long past? Kansas is more than a place, it is a living story. A story written not in ink or stone, but in wind and water, in the unseen forces that have shaped it for centuries. To outsiders, the state may seem like endless fields under endless skies, but to those who listen, the land speaks. The winds do not simply blow, they remember. They sweep across the prairies with the same restless breath that once carried the songs of the Kansa people. They howl against barns and silos just as they once howled across villages of earth lodges, their voice unchanged by time. Each storm, each sudden gust, is a reminder that the land's spirit cannot be stilled. The rivers, too, are more than moving water. They hold memory in their depths. They flow past cities now, but they still carry the same whispers they once shared with the Kansa, the same warning currents, the same promises of renewal. They flood, they recede, and they endure, as if refusing to let history settle into silence. And through it all, the name remains. Kansas. Spoken every day, etched on maps, printed on flags. A state named for a people who were driven away but not forgotten. Their presence lingers not only in syllables, but in spirit, woven into the identity of a place that could never truly escape its past. To live in Kansas is to live surrounded by memory, whether one knows it or not. Every wind that rattles a window, every river that surges against its banks, is more than weather. It is the land reminding us of who came before, and what was lost. It is a call to remember that this ground was never empty, never silent. Kansas is a land that remembers. Its winds remember. Its rivers remember. And long after maps are redrawn and generations pass, the memory will remain, restless, enduring, unbroken.